The next two techniques that I'm going to show you are how to avoid or get blooms in your watercolor. And this is what to do, what not to do, because it just kind of depends on what you're going for. If you're going for something that has those blooms, then you want to do it this way. But if you're trying not to get these blooms, I'm going to tell you what not to do. And then the next one is a variegated wash. Okay, so in order to get some blooms, or not get blooms, whatever you're going for in that specific way, you're gonna start out by putting down a wash of color. And I'm gonna pick something kind of medium color, not super dark, just so that you can see what's happening. So I'm going to use an orange, and I'm going to add lots of pigment, lots of water, and I'm going to go ahead and paint down the entire space with this. Now, if you're trying to get blooms, or trying to avoid blooms, you want to wait for this area to completely dry before you do anything to it, okay? But if you're trying to get blooms, you want those things to happen, you're going to work on this when it is almost dry. It's not puddle wet anymore. It's not even shiny wet anymore. It's just damp, okay? So we're going to let that dry for a second. We're going to go ahead and work on this variegated wash. And a variegated wash is done using a wet on wet technique. So I'm going to start with one color at the top, and I'm going to swipe it down to about the halfway point. And I'm going to make sure that the pigment is there. And then I'm going to grab another color. In this case, I'm going to use a similar color, and I am going to swipe that up from the bottom. And what I want to happen here is, while it's still wet, I want these two colors to meet in the middle, and I want them to mix. Okay, so that is basically like blending, is really all that is. Okay, this is still a little damp. It's not dry. Blooms are done with very wet paint. So I'm going to take a color, and I'm going to make sure that I've got lots of pigment, but also some water in there. And I'm going to start dropping it in different places. I'm gonna go ahead and swipe some across the bottom. You can already start seeing my blooms occurring, because while I still have somewhat of a crisp edge, you can see where it's starting to feather out along the edges and it's not staying crisp. You don't if you don't want blooms to happen, then you need to do this technique while this area is completely dry. If you want the blooms to happen, you do it while it's still damp. The next two techniques we're going to do, one is adding salt, which can add a nice texture. And then the next one would be the use of a plastic card or some kind of straight edge that's not necessarily sharp. So like, you could use an X-Acto knife, but I would use the side that's not the knife side. I would use the opposite of the blade side if you don't have a plastic card. Okay, so for salt, we're going to add a wet on dry wash to the space. Okay, so pick a color, any color. Usually dark colors work best for this, so maybe a dark purple, or even mix it up and do like a bluish purple, kind of like a midnight sort of color. Lots of pigment, lots of water, So I'm just mixing up over here off camera. All right, so I've got my colors. I'm going to quickly swipe this in, wet on dry, making sure that the whole thing is covered with pigment and paint. And before it completely dries, I will add salt. So we're gonna let it dry slightly. So we want shiny wet, not puddle wet when we do this technique, okay? And you want to also put some of this color in the next square too, just to kind of set that up and get that to the point where it is starting to dry out so we can do our technique there. So go ahead and throw some paint in the next section as well. Dry on wet again. And we want that to get damp before we're ready to move on to the next part of that. Okay, so while this one is still damp, it's shiny wet, not puddle wet, you're gonna take a small amount of salt and you're just gonna put it on the paper. Okay, and what happens is the salt is going to absorb some of the moisture that is still in the paint, and it's gonna give you a nice texture. And if you can't see that, I'm gonna zoom in slightly so you can kind of see in this area where you've got this little texture sort of going on, okay? So now for the plastic card section, I'm gonna take my plastic card and I am going to scrape paint off of an area. This can actually be a really nice technique for making rocks or anything that you want to pull the color off a little bit and you want to get kind of a weird look about it. You can also do this with the back of your X-Acto knife, but I'm going to tell you right now, don't pull too hard because you're going to end up pulling off paper. But you can do this with the card, you can do this with the knife, you can also do this with like maybe the plastic part of a Sharpie. Let's see if it works. Yeah, it kind of works. Okay, so that's plastic card. The next two techniques are known as sgraffito, and that's spelled S-G-R-A-F-F-I-T-O. And the other one is wax resist. Now, I know you've all done wax resist before. It's just like when you were younger and you did it with, crayons or whatever. So we're gonna do that, but you could use things like that when you're trying to leave highlights. You could put them all down with your crayons first and then go back and paint over top and not even worry about going around them. Okay, so for sgraffito, you're gonna start off by scratching into the paper while it's dry. So you could just put a couple little cuts here and there, little scratches. You just wanna be sure you're not scratching all the way through the paper. Then you're gonna add a wash of color over top. Okay, and I'm just gonna use a reddish orange. So I'm gonna put this wash of color right on top of it. And notice as I'm doing this, it is causing the paint to settle into those areas where I made the scratches. But you can also do this by scratching in to the paint while it's wet, and you get sort of a different look. Okay. Or you can go back and do it while it's dry. So we'll wait until this area dries and I'll show you what it looks like if you were to do it while it's dry. And this is just a few more while it's wet. Okay, the wax resist area, you are going to draw something with a light colored crayon in the space. And then we're gonna do a wet wash over that area. So I'm gonna take random color that I have here already mixed up, and I'm gonna go right over top of all of this. Okay, you wanna make sure that you do this kind of a wet on wet wash, but don't scrub too much at it, because what it starts doing is it starts covering up the things that you did. But as it dries, those areas will become more and more clear. So when you first put the paint over it, you might not see it very well, but it'll eventually show up.